The military academy's grand auditorium buzzed with anticipation as nearly 800 cadets, officers, and distinguished guests filled every available seat. The annual Defense Excellence Awards ceremony was the most prestigious event of the academic year, where outstanding service members received recognition for their contributions to national security. Elegant banners bearing the Academy's crest hung from the vaulted ceiling, while polished brass instruments of the military band gleamed under the bright stage lights. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her dress uniform one final time as she stood in the wings, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. At 28, she had already distinguished herself as one of the most promising young officers in her division. Her service record was impeccable, her leadership skills exceptional, and her dedication to her troops unquestionable. Today, she was scheduled to receive the Distinguished Service Medal for her heroic actions during a recent humanitarian mission overseas. The ceremony had been proceeding smoothly for over an hour. Various awards had been presented to deserving personnel, each recipient walking across the stage with pride and dignity while their families and colleagues applauded from the audience. The atmosphere was one of celebration and honor, exactly as such occasions should be. Colonel Richard Hawthorne, a man in his late 40s with a stern demeanor and an authoritative presence, served as the master of ceremonies. He had been in the military for over 2 decades, climbing the ranks through a combination of strategic thinking and some whispered political maneuvering. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, though not always for the right reasons. While his professional accomplishments were undeniable, there had been whispers throughout his career about his inappropriate behavior toward female personnel. These rumors had never resulted in formal charges or investigations. The military culture of the time often discouraged such reports, and Hawthorne had cultivated powerful allies who helped shield him from scrutiny. He was careful, calculating, and knew exactly how to operate within the system's blind spots. His victims often remained silent, knowing that speaking out could potentially destroy their own careers while having little impact on his. Sarah had heard the stories about Colonel Hawthorne, as had most female personnel on the base. The warnings were passed down informally from senior to junior officers, a sad tradition that had persisted for years. Stay alert around him, they were told. Never be alone in his presence. Don't give him any excuse to single you out. It was an unspoken reality that many women in the military had learned to navigate, adapting their behavior to protect themselves while trying to maintain their professional standing. As Sarah's name was called, and she began her walk across the stage, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The applause was thunderous, recognizing not just her recent achievements, but her potential for future leadership. She had worked incredibly hard to reach this moment, overcoming numerous obstacles, and proving herself in a male-dominated environment where every action was scrutinized and every mistake magnified. Colonel Hawthorne stood at the podium with the medal in his hands, his practiced smile in place as he prepared to make the presentation. To the audience, he appeared every inch the distinguished military leader, his uniform perfect and his bearing commanding. But Sarah noticed something in his eyes as she approached, a look she had learned to recognize and fear. The presentation itself followed the standard protocol. The colonel read from the citation, describing Sarah's courageous actions in detail while she stood at attention beside him. The audience listened respectfully, many nodding in appreciation of her service. When he finished reading, he stepped forward to pin the medal to her uniform, a moment that should have been the highlight of her military career thus far. It was during this seemingly routine procedure that Colonel Hawthorne made his move. As he reached around her to position the medal, his hands lingered far longer than necessary. Under the guise of adjusting the decoration, he deliberately made inappropriate contact, his fingers trailing across her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the medal ceremony, and everything to do with his pattern of predatory behavior. The violation happened in plain sight of hundreds of witnesses, yet was disguised as part of the formal ceremony. This was Hawthorne's method, his way of asserting power and satisfying his inappropriate impulses while maintaining plausible deniability. He had done this before, always in public settings where his victims felt trapped by protocol and military hierarchy. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger and disgust that every woman experiences when subjected to such treatment. But this time something was different. Perhaps it was the setting, with hundreds of her colleagues watching. Perhaps it was the significance of the moment, which was supposed to celebrate her achievements. Or perhaps it was simply that she had reached her breaking point with this type of behavior. Whatever the reason, Instead of enduring the assault silently, as so many had done before her, Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. The training that had made her an exceptional officer kicked in automatically. Years of martial arts instruction, combat preparation, and self-defense drills had honed her reflexes to a razor's edge. Her body responded faster than her mind could process the decision, muscle memory taking over in the face of the threat. In one fluid motion that took less than 2 seconds, Sarah grabbed Colonel Hawthorne's wrist with her left hand while her right hand drove upward in a precise defensive maneuver. The technique was textbook perfect, exactly as she had practiced thousands of times in training scenarios. The leverage was ideal, the angle was correct, and the force was more than sufficient to neutralize the threat. The sound of the bone breaking echoed through the auditorium's sound system, amplified by the microphones that had been picking up the ceremony. It was a sharp, distinct crack that made everyone in the audience wince, even though most didn't immediately understand what had happened. The colonel's cry of pain followed immediately, a sound of genuine shock and agony that cut through the formal atmosphere like a knife. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, absolute silence filled the massive auditorium. 800 people sat frozen in their seats, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The distinguished guests in the front row leaned forward, straining to understand the scene playing out before them. The military band members lowered their instruments, unsure whether to continue playing or stop entirely. Sarah stood perfectly still, her military bearing intact despite the chaos she had just unleashed. The medal hung askew on her uniform, finally, properly pinned but at tremendous cost. Her face showed no emotion, though her heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return, challenging not just a superior officer, but the entire system that had protected men like Hawthorne for decades. Colonel Hawthorne clutched his broken arm to his chest, his face contorted with pain and disbelief. In all his years of military service, through combat deployments and dangerous missions, he had never been so thoroughly and publicly humiliated. The carefully constructed image he had spent decades building was crumbling in real time, in front of the largest and most important audience possible. The Academy's commandant, a seasoned general who had seen combat in multiple conflicts, rose slowly from his seat in the front row. His weathered face showed a mixture of confusion, concern, and growing understanding as he began to piece together what had transpired. He had served alongside both officers and knew their reputations, though he had never witnessed such a dramatic confrontation in his decades of military service. Medical personnel, who were always present at large military gatherings, rushed onto the stage with practiced efficiency. Their assessment of the colonel's injury was swift and professional, though the severity was already apparent to anyone with medical training. The break was clean but significant, requiring immediate attention and likely surgery to repair properly. As the medical team worked to stabilize the injured officer, security personnel began moving toward the stage, though they seemed uncertain about how to proceed. This was uncharted territory for everyone involved. Military protocol provided clear guidance for most situations, but a junior officer physically attacking a superior during an award ceremony was so unprecedented that there was no established procedure to follow. The audience remained transfixed, witnessing what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about incidents in the Academy's long history. Camera crews, who had been recording the ceremony for posterity, continued filming despite the chaos, capturing every moment of the unprecedented scene for future analysis and investigation. Sarah knew that her military career had just taken a dramatic and possibly terminal turn. The consequences of her actions would be severe and far-reaching, regardless of the justification she might claim. Military justice was swift and often unforgiving, particularly when it came to violations of the chain of command. Yet as she stood there, watching the chaos unfold around her, she felt no regret for defending herself against an assault that should never have been tolerated in the first place. The ceremony's formal atmosphere had completely dissolved, replaced by urgent whispered conversations and the controlled chaos of emergency response. Distinguished guests were being quietly escorted from their seats while military police began securing the scene. The evening's celebration of military excellence had transformed into a crisis that would require careful management to prevent lasting damage to the Academy's reputation. In that moment, as medical personnel prepared to transport Colonel Hawthorne to the base hospital and security forces approached her position, Sarah realized that her actions had initiated something much larger than a simple confrontation between two officers. She had challenged a system that had operated in shadows for far too long, forcing it into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The consequences would extend far beyond her own career, potentially affecting policies, procedures, and attitudes throughout the entire military establishment. The broken arm was just the beginning of what would prove to be a much more complex and far-reaching fracture in the military's institutional culture, one that had been building pressure for years and had finally found its release point in a moment of justified resistance against unacceptable behavior. The base hospital's emergency room had seen its share of injuries over the years, from training accidents to combat wounds. But the arrival of Colonel Hawthorne under these circumstances created an immediate stir among the medical staff. Word of what had happened at the awards ceremony was already spreading through the base's communication networks faster than wildfire, carried by text messages, phone calls, and hushed conversations in hallways and offices throughout the installation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the chief orthopedic surgeon on duty that evening, examined the colonel's injury with professional detachment while trying to ignore the whispered conversations happening around her. The break was indeed severe, involving both the radius and ulna bones of his forearm, requiring immediate surgical intervention to ensure proper healing. As she prepared for the emergency surgery, she couldn't help but notice the irony that she was treating a man whose reputation for inappropriate behavior toward women was well known throughout the medical community. Meanwhile, back at the academy, Sarah found herself in a sterile conference room under the watchful eyes of two military police officers. The room was typically used for routine meetings and briefings, but tonight it served as a temporary holding area while senior officers decided how to handle the unprecedented situation. The walls were lined with official portraits of past academy commandants, their stern gazes seeming to judge her actions from across the decades. The academy's legal officer, Major Thomas Bradley, had been called away from his family dinner to deal with what his commanding officer had described as an incident requiring immediate attention. A career military lawyer with 15 years of experience handling complex cases, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The intersection of assault charges, sexual harassment allegations, and the very public nature of the incident created a legal puzzle that would require careful navigation. General Morrison, the academy commandant, paced his office while receiving updates from various sources. Phone calls were coming in from the Pentagon, congressional liaisons, and media representatives who had somehow already gotten wind of the story. The general had built his career on maintaining order and discipline, and the events of this evening threatened to undermine everything he had worked to achieve at the academy. The investigation that would follow required delicate handling from multiple perspectives. Colonel Hawthorne's version of events, once he recovered sufficiently from surgery to give a statement, painted Sarah as an unstable officer who had attacked him without provocation during what he claimed was a routine medal presentation. He insisted that any contact during the ceremony was purely accidental and within normal protocol, denying any inappropriate behavior. Sarah's account, given to investigators in the early hours of the morning after the incident, was detailed and unflinching. She described not only the specific actions that had triggered her defensive response, but also provided context about Colonel Hawthorne's pattern of behavior that many women on the base had experienced. Her testimony was clear, consistent, and delivered with the same precision she brought to all her military duties. The challenge for investigators was that the incident had occurred in full view of hundreds of witnesses, yet most had been too far away to observe the subtle details that had precipitated Sarah's reaction. The ceremony had been filmed from multiple angles, but the cameras had been focused on the overall presentation rather than the intimate details of the medal pinning process. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who served as the base's advocate for sexual assault prevention, found herself thrust into the center of the controversy. She had been working quietly for years to address the cultural issues that allowed predators like Hawthorne to operate with impunity, but had struggled against institutional resistance and the reluctance of victims to come forward. Sarah's dramatic action had suddenly brought all these underlying issues into the harsh glare of public attention. The base's communication office was working overtime to manage the growing media interest in the story. Initial reports had been vague, describing only an incident at a military awards ceremony, but investigative journalists were already digging deeper. Social media posts from academy personnel and their families were providing additional details, creating a narrative that the official channels couldn't control. Female personnel throughout the base found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Many had experienced similar treatment from Colonel Hawthorne, but had never reported it, either because they feared retaliation or because they doubted anything would be done. Sarah's actions had given them hope that justice might finally be possible, but they also worried about the potential backlash against women in the military if the incident was handled poorly. The colonel's allies in the military hierarchy were already mobilizing to protect his reputation and minimize the damage to his career. They argued that even if some inappropriate contact had occurred, the physical assault was a disproportionate response that violated fundamental military discipline. They pointed to Sarah's relatively junior rank and suggested that her actions represented a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire command structure. Dr. Rodriguez completed the surgical repair of Colonel Hawthorne's arm in the early morning hours, her skilled hands working to restore function while her mind grappled with the broader implications of treating someone she personally considered a predator. The surgery was successful from a medical standpoint, though the psychological impact on the colonel would prove to be far more lasting than the physical injury. As dawn broke over the military installation, the full scope of the crisis became apparent to senior leadership. What had begun as a prestigious awards ceremony had evolved into a public relations nightmare that threatened to expose decades of institutional failures. The Pentagon was demanding immediate answers, while congressional representatives were already scheduling hearings to investigate the military's handling of sexual harassment complaints. Sarah spent her first night after the incident in temporary quarters under informal house arrest, though no formal charges had yet been filed. She used the quiet hours to reflect on the events that had led to this moment, tracing the path from her childhood dreams of military service through the years of training and advancement that had brought her to this crossroads. She felt no regret for her actions, even knowing the personal cost would likely be severe. The Academy's female faculty members found themselves caught between their professional obligations and their personal convictions. Many had witnessed the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination that pervaded military culture, but had learned to navigate it quietly to protect their own careers. Sarah's bold action forced them to confront their own complicity in maintaining a system that protected perpetrators while silencing victims. Military legal experts from across the country were already analyzing the case, recognizing its potential to set important precedents for future situations. The intersection of legitimate self-defense, military hierarchy, and sexual harassment created legal questions that had never been fully tested in military courts. Legal scholars predicted that regardless of the immediate outcome, the case would influence military justice policy for years to come. The local civilian media had picked up the story by morning, though initial reports were limited by the military's classification of ongoing investigations. However, civilian journalists were already reaching out to former military personnel who might have insights into the Academy's culture, and particularly into Colonel Hawthorne's history of behavior that had been overlooked or ignored by his superiors. Behind closed doors, honest discussions about military culture were finally happening at levels of leadership where they had been avoided for years. The incident had created a moment of reckoning that could no longer be postponed or managed through traditional methods. Senior officers who had spent their careers maintaining institutional stability were being forced to confront the reality that stability built on injustice was ultimately unsustainable. The colonel's medical recovery would take months, but his professional recovery might never occur. Even if he were cleared of any wrongdoing, the public nature of the incident had made him a liability that the military hierarchy might be unwilling to continue protecting. His powerful allies were already beginning to distance themselves, recognizing that association with the controversy could damage their own careers. Sarah's supporters within the military were organizing quietly, coordinating their efforts to ensure her side of the story received proper consideration. These allies came from across all ranks and specialties, united by their belief that her actions, while extreme, were justified given the circumstances and the failure of official channels to address the underlying problem. The investigation team assembled to examine the case represented the military's best efforts to ensure fairness and thoroughness. Led by Colonel Patricia Stevens, a respected officer with a reputation for integrity, the team included specialists in military law, behavioral psychology, and organizational culture. Their mission was to determine not just what had happened during those crucial seconds on stage, but also to examine the systemic failures that had allowed the situation to develop. As the second day after the incident began, the military installation remained under intense scrutiny from media, congressional staff, and advocacy groups. The normal routine of training exercises, classes, and administrative functions continued, but with an undercurrent of tension that affected everyone from senior officers to entry-level personnel. Conversations in dining halls, barracks, and offices inevitably turned to the incident and its implications. The broader military community was also grappling with the implications of Sarah's actions. Similar incidents of inappropriate behavior by senior officers were being reported at installations across the country, as news of the Academy incident gave other victims the courage to come forward. What had begun as a single confrontation was evolving into a movement that would challenge the military's approach to sexual harassment and assault prevention. The pressure on military leadership to respond decisively and appropriately was immense. Failure to handle the situation correctly could result in congressional intervention, public protests, and fundamental changes to military policies imposed from outside the institution. The stakes were higher than just determining the fate of two individual officers. The entire military's credibility was on the line. The formal investigation began 3 days after the incident, with Colonel Patricia Stevens establishing her temporary headquarters in a secure conference facility away from the main Academy buildings. Her team had grown to include specialists from various military branches, civilian consultants with expertise in workplace harassment, and forensic analysts who would examine every available piece of evidence from the ceremony. The video footage from the awards ceremony became the centerpiece of the technical investigation. Multiple camera angles had captured the event, though none had been specifically focused on the medal pinning process itself. Digital enhancement specialists worked around the clock to extract every possible detail from the recordings, using sophisticated software to analyze movements, timing, and positioning during the critical moments. Meanwhile, the human side of the investigation required delicate handling of witness interviews. The hundreds of attendees at the ceremony represented a cross-section of military society, from junior enlisted personnel to general officers, along with civilian guests and family members. Each witness brought their own perspective, biases, and level of understanding about what they had observed. Captain Maria Santos, who had been seated in the third row during the ceremony, provided one of the most detailed witness accounts. As a female officer who had served under Colonel Hawthorne's command 2 years earlier, she brought both proximity to the incident and personal experience with his behavior. Her testimony revealed a pattern of inappropriate conduct that extended far beyond the single incident at the awards ceremony. The investigation team discovered that complaints about Colonel Hawthorne's behavior had been filed intermittently over the past decade, but had been handled through informal channels that resulted in verbal counseling rather than formal disciplinary action. The complaint files, some of which had been archived and nearly forgotten, painted a disturbing picture of an officer who had learned to exploit the military's reluctance to pursue sexual harassment cases aggressively. Dr. Michelle Clark, a civilian psychologist specializing in organizational behavior, joined the investigation to provide expert analysis of the institutional factors that had allowed the situation to develop. Her examination of military culture, hierarchy, and gender dynamics provided crucial context for understanding why Sarah's response had been so explosive and why similar incidents might occur if systemic changes weren't implemented. The legal complexities of the case grew more apparent as the investigation progressed. Military law provided clear guidelines for assault cases, but the circumstances of this particular incident challenged traditional interpretations. Sarah's actions could be viewed as criminal assault against a superior officer, justified self-defense against sexual assault, or a complex combination of both, depending on the legal framework applied. Colonel Hawthorne returned to limited duty after a week in the hospital, his arm in a cast that served as a visible reminder of the incident to everyone on the base. His demeanor had changed noticeably. The confident swagger that had characterized his leadership style was replaced by a more cautious approach that suggested he understood his position had been fundamentally altered by the events of that evening. The media attention surrounding the case intensified as investigative reporters began uncovering additional stories about military sexual harassment. National news networks assigned their best military correspondents to cover the story, recognizing its potential to expose broader institutional problems that had been hidden from public view for decades. The Academy found itself under microscopic scrutiny that extended far beyond the immediate incident. Congressional hearings were scheduled within 2 weeks of the incident, as lawmakers demanded accountability and answers about military policies regarding sexual harassment prevention and response. The House Armed Services Committee announced that it would examine not only this specific case, but also the broader question of whether the military was capable of policing itself when it came to protecting service members from predatory behavior. Sarah's legal representation was provided by Captain David Kim, a military defense attorney with a reputation for handling complex cases involving military justice and constitutional rights. His challenge was to defend actions that were clearly insubordinate under military law while arguing that they were both legally justified and morally necessary given the circumstances and institutional failures. The investigation revealed that Sarah's exemplary service record included multiple commendations for leadership, integrity, and professional excellence. Character witnesses from her previous assignments painted a picture of an officer who had consistently demonstrated sound judgment and unwavering ethical standards. This created a puzzling contrast with the apparent loss of control that had led to the physical confrontation. Female veterans organizations rallied to Sarah's support, organizing letter-writing campaigns and public demonstrations calling for her exoneration. These advocacy groups had been fighting for years to bring attention to sexual harassment in the military, and they viewed her case as a watershed moment that could finally force meaningful change. Their support provided crucial public relations balance to counter the military establishment's tendency to protect the institutional hierarchy. The colonel's medical team reported that his arm was healing properly, but psychological evaluations suggested he was experiencing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. The public humiliation and professional consequences of the incident had shattered his carefully constructed self-image and forced him to confront aspects of his behavior that he had previously been able to rationalize or ignore. Internal military discussions about the case revealed deep divisions within the officer corps about how to handle the situation. Traditionalists argued that military discipline required severe punishment for Sarah's actions regardless of the provocation, while reformers saw an opportunity to address systemic problems that had been ignored for too long. These philosophical differences reflected broader tensions within the military about adaptation to changing social expectations. The investigation team discovered additional evidence that Colonel Hawthorne's inappropriate behavior had been reported by multiple women over the years, but that the reports had been handled through informal channels that protected his career while providing no real accountability. This pattern of institutional protection for perpetrators while silencing victims had created the conditions that led to Sarah's dramatic response. Expert witnesses in military law testified about the precedents that might apply to the case, exploring questions about the limits of military authority, the rights of service members to defend themselves against assault, and the balance between maintaining discipline and protecting individual rights. The legal arguments were complex and unprecedented, requiring careful analysis of constitutional principles and military regulations. The Academy's reputation suffered significant damage as details about the institutional culture emerged during the investigation. Alumni, donors, and political supporters expressed concerns about the values being promoted at an institution that was supposed to develop ethical military leaders. The Academy's leadership faced pressure to implement immediate reforms while the investigation was still ongoing. Dr. Rodriguez, the surgeon who had repaired Colonel Hawthorne's arm, was called to testify about the medical aspects of the injury. Her professional assessment confirmed that the break was consistent with a defensive maneuver designed to stop an assault rather than an offensive attack intended to cause maximum damage. This technical evidence supported Sarah's claim that her response had been measured and appropriate to the threat she faced. The psychological evaluation of Sarah revealed no signs of mental instability or tendency toward violence that might explain her actions as anything other than a rational response to an intolerable situation. The evaluation did reveal, however, high levels of stress related to her experiences navigating military culture as a woman, suggesting that her breaking point had been building over time rather than occurring spontaneously. Military personnel throughout the armed forces were following the case closely, understanding that its outcome would set important precedents for future situations. Female service members in particular felt that Sarah's case represented their own struggles with harassment and discrimination, while male officers grappled with questions about their own behavior and the culture they had helped create or maintain. The investigation's preliminary findings suggested that while Sarah's physical response violated military regulations regarding assault on superior officers, the provocation she experienced was both criminal and a violation of her fundamental rights. This created a legal and ethical dilemma that would require careful consideration of competing principles and values. The public relations challenge for the military extended beyond managing media coverage to addressing concerns from political leaders, military families, and the general public about institutional culture and values. The incident had exposed aspects of military life that many civilians found shocking and unacceptable, creating pressure for comprehensive reforms that went far beyond addressing individual cases of misconduct. As the investigation entered its final phase, the evidence painted a complex picture of institutional failure, individual courage, and the collision between military hierarchy and fundamental human rights. The team preparing their final report understood that their recommendations would influence military policy and culture for generations to come, making their conclusions among the most important in the Academy's long history. The weight of precedent hung heavily over every aspect of the investigation, as legal experts, military leaders, and advocacy groups recognized that the case would establish principles for handling similar situations in the future. The stakes were higher than just determining the fate of two individual officers. The entire military's approach to sexual harassment prevention and response was being evaluated and potentially transformed. The court-martial proceedings began 6 weeks after the incident, held in the Academy's largest courtroom to accommodate the unprecedented level of interest from media, military personnel, and civilian observers. The military justice system, designed to maintain order and discipline within the armed forces, found itself grappling with a case that challenged fundamental assumptions about authority, justice, and the rights of service members. Lieutenant General Rebecca Hayes, serving as the presiding military judge, brought 30 years of experience to a case unlike any she had encountered in her distinguished career. Her reputation for fairness and thorough analysis made her the obvious choice to oversee proceedings that would be scrutinized by legal experts, advocacy groups, and the general public. The pressure to ensure both justice and the appearance of justice was immense. The prosecution, led by Colonel Marcus Webb, faced the challenging task of proving that Sarah's actions constituted criminal assault while acknowledging the context that had provoked her response. Their strategy focused on military discipline and the fundamental principle that physical violence against superior officers could never be justified, regardless of provocation. They argued that alternative courses of action were available and that her response was disproportionate to the threat. Sarah's defense team, expanded to include civilian attorney Rebecca Morrison, a specialist in sexual assault cases, presented their case around the principle of self-defense and the failure of institutional systems to protect service members from predatory behavior. They argued that Sarah's actions were not only justified but necessary, given the immediate threat she faced and the pattern of institutional indifference to complaints about Colonel Hawthorne's behavior. The testimony phase began with technical evidence about the medical and physical aspects of the incident. Dr. Rodriguez provided detailed analysis of Colonel Hawthorne's injury, confirming that the break was consistent with a defensive maneuver rather than an aggressive attack. Biomechanical experts testified about the force and precision required to produce the specific type of injury, supporting the defense's argument that Sarah's response was measured and appropriate. Colonel Hawthorne's testimony was the most anticipated moment of the proceedings. His account maintained that the metal pinning had followed standard protocol and that any contact was accidental and appropriate for the ceremony. Under cross-examination, however, his story began to show inconsistencies, particularly when confronted with testimony from other witnesses about his pattern of behavior during similar ceremonies. The defense's strategy became clearer as they called a series of female witnesses who testified about their experiences with Colonel Hawthorne over the years. Captain Santos described incidents of inappropriate touching during official functions, while Major Lisa Patterson recounted comments and behavior that had made her uncomfortable, but that she had been reluctant to report through official channels. These testimonies revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that had been enabled by a military culture that discouraged complaints against senior officers and provided multiple opportunities for such misconduct to occur. The witnesses described feeling trapped between their professional obligations and their personal safety, unable to confront the behavior directly without risking their careers. The prosecution attempted to minimize these testimonies by arguing that even if previous inappropriate behavior had occurred, it did not justify Sarah's violent response. They maintained that military discipline required adherence to proper channels for addressing grievances, and that taking matters into one's own hands undermined the entire structure of military authority. Expert testimony about military culture and sexual harassment provided crucial context for understanding the broader implications of the case. Dr. Clark explained how institutional barriers to reporting, fear of retaliation, and the military's emphasis on hierarchy created conditions where predatory behavior could flourish unchecked. Her analysis suggested that Sarah's response represented the inevitable result of systemic failures rather than an isolated incident of misconduct. The courtroom was packed each day with observers representing various interests and perspectives. Female service members attended whenever their duties permitted, viewing the proceedings as a test of whether the military justice system could protect them from harassment. Male officers watched with concern about the precedent that might be set and its potential impact on military discipline and authority structures. Media coverage of the trial was extensive and generally sympathetic to Sarah, though military legal experts cautioned that public opinion would have little influence on the military justice process. The proceedings were broadcast live on military television networks and covered extensively by civilian media, making it one of the most widely watched military trials in recent memory. The turning point in the trial came during the testimony of Master Sergeant Kevin Thompson, a veteran military photographer who had been documenting the awards ceremony. His detailed analysis of the photographic evidence, enhanced through digital processing, provided visual confirmation of Colonel Hawthorne's inappropriate contact during the medal pinning. The photographs showed his hands in positions that clearly exceeded the requirements of the ceremony. This evidence corroborated Sarah's account of the incident and demonstrated that her response had been to a real and ongoing assault rather than to accidental or appropriate contact. The visual evidence was particularly powerful because it was objective and unfiltered by personal interpretation or bias. Colonel Hawthorne's cross-examination became increasingly difficult as the photographic evidence was presented. His explanations for the hand positions became less credible, and his demeanor showed the strain of maintaining his version of events in the face of contradictory evidence. The confident bearing that had characterized his military career began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. The defense called character witnesses who testified about Sarah's integrity, professionalism, and consistent demonstration of sound judgment throughout her career. Her former commanding officers praised her leadership abilities and ethical standards, painting a picture of an officer whose actions on that evening were completely out of character unless justified by extraordinary circumstances. Psychological experts testified about the impact of sexual harassment on victims and the physiological responses that occur during assault situations. They explained how Sarah's training as a combat officer would have created automatic defensive responses when she perceived a threat, suggesting that her reaction was both instantaneous and appropriate given her preparation for defending herself and others. The prosecution's case began to weaken as witness after witness confirmed both the inappropriate nature of Colonel Hawthorne's behavior and the institutional failures that had allowed it to continue unchecked. Their argument that Sarah should have used alternative channels to address her grievances was undermined by testimony showing that such channels had been ineffective in preventing or stopping the harassment. Legal experts following the case noted that the proceedings were establishing important precedents about the rights of service members to defend themselves against assault, even when committed by superior officers. The case was being watched by military legal professionals worldwide as a potential watershed moment in the evolution of military justice principles. The testimony phase concluded with Sarah's own account of the incident. Her detailed, consistent, and emotionally compelling description of the assault and her response provided a powerful conclusion to the defense's case. Under cross-examination, she maintained her composure and her version of events, demonstrating the same qualities that had made her an outstanding officer throughout her career. The closing arguments summarized the complex legal and ethical issues that the court would need to resolve. The prosecution emphasized the importance of military discipline and the dangerous precedent that would be set by exonerating an officer who had physically assaulted a superior. The defense focused on the right of self-defense and the moral imperative to resist sexual assault, regardless of the perpetrator's rank or position. As the court recessed to deliberate, observers recognized that the decision would influence military culture and policy for decades to come. The case had exposed fundamental tensions between military hierarchy and individual rights, between institutional loyalty and personal integrity, and between traditional military values and evolving social expectations. The deliberation period lasted 3 days, during which time the Academy and the broader military community remained in a state of suspended animation. Training exercises continued, Normal duties were performed, but everyone understood that the outcome of the trial would mark either the beginning of fundamental changes in military culture or the reaffirmation of traditional hierarchical structures that protected institutional authority above individual rights. The announcement that a verdict had been reached sent shockwaves through the military establishment and civilian advocacy communities. The courtroom was packed to capacity as Lieutenant General Hayes prepared to announce a decision that would determine not only Sarah's future, but also signal the military's commitment to addressing sexual harassment and protecting the rights of service members to defend themselves against assault. The verdict announcement drew representatives from major news networks, military officials from across the country, and advocacy groups who had been following the case as a potential turning point. In military culture, Lieutenant General Hayes took her position at the bench with the gravity appropriate to a decision that would influence military justice for generations to come. The court found Sarah not guilty of assault charges, ruling that her actions constituted justified self-defense against sexual assault. The decision was based on the preponderance of evidence showing that Colonel Hawthorne had committed assault during the medal ceremony, that Sarah's response was proportionate to the threat she faced, and that institutional failures had left her with no reasonable alternative for protecting herself. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause from Sarah's supporters and stunned silence from those who had expected military hierarchy to be upheld regardless of the circumstances. Sarah herself showed little emotion, maintaining the disciplined composure that had characterized her throughout the proceedings, though those close to her could see the relief in her eyes. The written opinion accompanying the verdict was thorough and carefully reasoned, addressing the complex legal and ethical issues that the case had raised. Lieutenant General Hayes emphasized that while military discipline remained fundamental to effective operations, it could not be used to shield criminal behavior or deny service members their basic rights to personal safety and dignity. The decision established important precedents about the limits of military authority and the rights of service members to defend themselves against assault by superior officers. The court ruled that rank and position did not provide immunity from criminal prosecution for sexual assault, and that victims had both the right and sometimes the obligation to defend themselves when institutional systems failed to provide protection. Colonel Hawthorne's military career effectively ended with the verdict, though formal disciplinary proceedings would follow. His resignation from active duty was accepted within days of the court's decision, and he faced potential civilian criminal charges related to the sexual assault. The powerful allies who had protected him throughout his career distanced themselves quickly, recognizing that association with his case had become a liability. The institutional changes that followed the verdict were swift and comprehensive. The Secretary of Defense announced a complete review of sexual harassment prevention and response policies, with implementation of new procedures designed to encourage reporting and ensure accountability. The military's approach to these issues would be fundamentally altered by the precedents established in Sarah's case. Sarah's reinstatement to full duty came with a promotion and assignment to a position where her experience and perspective could contribute to the institutional reforms being implemented. Her courage in confronting both the immediate assault and the broader system that had enabled it made her a natural choice for helping to design and implement new policies that would protect future service members. The Academy itself underwent significant changes in leadership and culture following the trial. General Morrison retired early, accepting responsibility for the institutional failures that had allowed Colonel Hawthorne's behavior to continue unchecked. His replacement, General Patricia Williams, brought a strong commitment to cultural change and zero tolerance for sexual harassment or assault. Training programs throughout the military were revised to address the lessons learned from the case. New curricula emphasized not only the prevention of sexual harassment, but also the rights and obligations of service members when confronted with assault by superior officers. The traditional emphasis on absolute obedience to authority was balanced with education about ethical decision-making and personal responsibility. The case's impact extended beyond the military to civilian institutions grappling with similar issues of sexual harassment and institutional protection of perpetrators. Corporate training programs, educational institutions, and government agencies studied the military's response as a model for addressing systemic problems that had been ignored or inadequately addressed for decades. Congressional oversight of military sexual assault prevention became more rigorous and sustained following the case. Legislative changes strengthened protections for victims and whistleblowers while establishing new accountability mechanisms for commanders who failed to address harassment and assault complaints adequately. The political response reflected public outrage about institutional failures that had been exposed during the trial. Women's advocacy organizations celebrated the verdict as a victory for all victims of sexual harassment and assault, not just those in the military. The case demonstrated that even powerful institutions could be forced to confront their failures and implement meaningful reforms when victims had the courage to resist and seek justice. The long-term career implications for Sarah were overwhelmingly positive. Her actions had demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and ethical leadership that the military claimed to value, and her subsequent contributions to policy reform established her as a rising star within the officer corps. Her story became part of military leadership training, illustrating the importance of standing up for principles even when the personal cost might be high. Dr. Rodriguez, who had treated Colonel Hawthorne's injury, found herself serving on committees designing new medical protocols for treating victims and perpetrators of sexual assault within the military medical system. Her professional expertise and personal insights into the case made her a valuable contributor to efforts aimed at improving the institutional response to these incidents. The media coverage of the case and its aftermath helped educate the general public about issues that had been hidden within military culture for decades. Investigative reporting following the trial revealed similar incidents at installations across the country, leading to additional investigations and reforms that might never have occurred without the visibility created by Sarah's dramatic action. The psychological impact on military personnel, particularly women, was profound and lasting. Female service members reported feeling more empowered to report harassment and assault, while male personnel expressed greater awareness of appropriate professional behavior and their responsibilities as bystanders when witnessing inappropriate conduct. Colonel Hawthorne's civilian life after leaving the military proved difficult as the notoriety of the case followed him into private employment. The public nature of the trial and verdict made it challenging for him to rebuild his career, serving as a powerful deterrent for other military personnel who might be tempted to abuse their positions of authority. The Academy's alumni associations grappled with questions about their institution's reputation and values following the case. Many graduates expressed pride that their academy had ultimately chosen justice over institutional protection, while others worried about the impact on military discipline and authority structures. These debates reflected broader societal discussions about power, accountability, and the balance between institutional loyalty and moral principles. Legal scholars continued to analyze the case's implications for military law and civilian criminal justice long after the verdict was announced. The precedents established by the court's decision influenced subsequent cases involving self-defense, institutional liability, and the rights of individuals within hierarchical organizations. The transformation of military culture that began with Sarah's dramatic action continued to evolve in the years following the trial. Regular surveys of military personnel showed gradual improvements in reporting rates for sexual harassment and assault, along with increased confidence that complaints would be investigated thoroughly and fairly. Training facilities throughout the military displayed copies of the court's written opinion as part of their educational programs, ensuring that future military leaders understood both their authority and its limits. The case became a touchstone for discussions about ethical leadership, personal courage, and the responsibility to protect those under one's command. Sarah's story inspired similar actions by victims of harassment and assault in various institutional settings, demonstrating that individual courage could catalyze broader systemic change. Her willingness to accept the personal risks of confronting both an immediate assault and the institutional system that enabled it provided a model for others facing similar situations. The broken arm that had resulted from that dramatic moment on stage became a symbol of broader fractures in institutional cultures that had protected perpetrators while silencing victims. The healing process for both individuals and institutions would take years, but the decisive action taken during those few seconds had initiated changes that would protect countless future victims from similar treatment. As Sarah continued her military career in positions of increasing responsibility, she carried with her the knowledge that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for institutional change. Her story served as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in conference rooms, auditoriums, and courtrooms where the fundamental values of justice and human dignity are defended against those who would compromise them for personal gain or institutional convenience. The legacy of that evening when hundreds of witnesses saw a colonel cross the line and watched a lieutenant break his arm in response would continue to influence military culture, legal precedent, and social awareness for decades to come, proving that individual courage in the face of institutional failure could indeed change the world.